So for today's video, I wanted to try something a little different. So this is going to be kind of like a educational, like history video, like in-depth discussion, basically going over the whole superhero archetype or comic book archetype of shrinking superheroes, superheroes that can change their size from from their normal size to smaller. Uh, by default, any characters that can go large will also be listed if they can go small as well, but not characters that can only go large, such as Giganta. I don't believe, I'm pretty sure she can't shrink, so she's not on this list or mentioned in this video. But so this is basically for the archetype of shrinking heroes, which the original shrinking hero, the one credited with the first appearance of this power set, would be Doll Man, featured here from Feature Comics. He was first created in 1939 by Will Eisner, I believe is how you say his name. He's a very famous comic book artist slash writer, most known for creating the classic character, the Spirit. And opened up his own art studio years later, where he taught many of the brightest, artists of that era, really ushering in a whole new era of quality artists during that time. Dollman is an interesting character, a very interesting character, because initially the power set of shrinking doesn't really sound appealing. It really doesn't. I mean, it's got its own practical uses within the confines of the comic book world and the superhero world, but on paper, it really doesn't sound like a very powerful thing to do. From an advertising and marketing standpoint, the power set doesn't seem is very not appealing either. It's very comes off as very silly. Especially I can imagine back in this time period of the 1930s, 1940s. Also, the name Doll Man doesn't really instill a whole lot of intimidation or cool factor into it. And the reason why he's called Doll Man is I'm obviously sure it comes from the idea that he can only shrink to about, what is it, 6 inches or 11 inches? No, 6 inches, I believe. About the average size of a doll or action figure. But of course, back then, the term action figure hadn't been created yet. The term, a little bit of trivia here. The term action figure actually was created because of the G.I. Joe dolls that would come out in the late 50s, early 60s, and because they were trying to market them to a different audience than what dolls were normally marketed to, because dolls were normally marketed to girls, and they wanted to make these G.I. Joe dolls attractive to young boys, but the name doll just doesn't really work with that, especially with parents, and boys just not knowing, being programmed not to like dolls. So, they came up with the term action figure, which was much more appealing to young boys and the parents and stuff. And just, and there came that classic separation that action figures are basically boys' versions of dolls. And of course, those terms have kind of changed over the years and stuff, but I'm getting away from myself. The fact that term wasn't around yet, he became Doll Man. And I can imagine that a character like this is obviously meant to be marketed to young boys. Obviously, this is not a character that would really be interested to girls. But you would have to think that a character with this name and this power set wouldn't really be all that attractive to the target audience of young boys or young males especially during the World War II era. This was a different time, but apparently the comic book did well. It had like 47 issues before it got canceled, which is a pretty impressive run, for back then. Well, it's pretty impressive today's standards too. I mean, most characters that are not popular don't get 47 issues of a comic book. But the character did cause a lot of controversy, especially because of this. Especially because of covers like this. There was apparently a lot of covers where the character was bound, tied up in weird, kind of possibly, sexual bondage inducing kind of positions. And things like that were kind of silly, and people really fought too much into it. That There's a lot of, the same thing with the whole Wonder Woman controversy, because Wonder Woman was always bound in her old school covers. But of course, the guy that created her was into bondage, and it was, I mean, that's, you could totally see that correlation. Anyway, what I'm getting at is, the Doll Man had some very interesting covers, a lot of which also involved the use of everyday objects turned into dangerous, obstacles that the hero had to overcome, which has become a classic. Part of the whole shrinking superhero kind of niche, is that a lot of times your covers feature everyday things being incredibly dangerous to the character, like such as the character running away from a lawnmower that's trying to eat him, or like a small dog chasing the hero as like it's a giant behemoth, and that's just part of the whole thing. There's a certain level of creativity to be found with the whole shrinking superheroes that you just don't see in other comic books, especially in the art direction. You can do a lot of really cool covers that you normally wouldn't be able to really do because of the perspectives of a shrinking hero. Everything is more dangerous. It's like I was just saying, you could turn a small dog into a big threat on a cover, or like the cover a while ago, you can turn a running faucet into a torture death device to the superhero, where normally it would just be something they wash their hands in. It's just really interesting how you can do things like that. You can change up the perspectives. You can change up the threat levels of things with the whole shrinking superhero concept. Another thing that's really interesting about the shrinking superhero concept that you can kind of play around with, and a lot of artists and writers do this, is turning everyday objects into tools, and use them in different ways than you normally would. A great example of this is how Doll Man has a model airplane, a fully functional model airplane, sitting in his office. It just sits on a podium like it's a model, but in reality, it's actually his vehicle. The way he gets from point A to point B, it's hidden in plain sight, and it's a really cool concept, and it works. Unfortunately, Doll Man's comic book series would come to an end, and the character in the concept of size shrinking, or shrinking size, would just, it would fade away. It would shrink into oblivion for about 2 decades, until the Atomic Age would usher in an entire new suite of characters and concepts, bringing with the Atom, Ray Palmer, bringing back the shrinking hero in a whole new perspective and a whole new level of shrinking. Ray Palmer didn't just shrink to the size of a small toy. He could shrink down to the size of a subatomic atom, which was something that was just, unheard of. And it ushered in a whole different level of story arcing, story building, and art design. You could do so much more with the ability to shrink that much smaller. Now you could include, a much more scientific, much more sci-fi element to the concept of the character. Doll Man, a level that Doll Man stories could never get to. You could go into a subatomic world. You could see atoms splitting and all these subatomic things that I have no idea, no knowledge of. You could do that with a character like the Atom, and you could have a much more vibrant, fantastical art design because of it. Again, Atom is not really the most interesting power to, when you think about it in terms of it's not a superpower that we sit around and talk about. Oh yeah, I want the ability to shrink down, but it is a useful power, especially for espionage and sneaking around. And the Atom was more using it for scientific purposes, research purposes. But it's interesting. There was just so much more opportunity to have creative uses of the power set, such as this one, which is one of my favorite things that the Atom is known for: traveling through phones. Just going subatomic level and traveling through the phone wires, like the landlines, and just being able to get to point A to point B in a very, very, very quick manner. It was a very cool thing. I always liked seeing it in the old school comics where he would just come out of somebody's phone while they're talking to him, and all of a sudden, boop, the Atom just comes out, turns normal size, and it's like, what? it was just a cool thing, and I can imagine reading it for the first time back then, as you know, as a kid in the '60s. That had to be the coolest thing, you know, a very cool visual. Years later, the Atom would break new ground in the whole shrinking superhero genre by with a miniseries called Sword of the Atom, in which the Atom loses the ability to turn back to normal size. His belt, which is what gives him his powers, gets damaged, and he gets stuck kind of like at probably like a bug size, person, and he ends up discovering that there's this entire tribe, sub species of people that are just little tiny people. They're little tiny humanoids, and he gets caught up in a big civil war between them, and he like becomes a fighter in their gladiator competitions. Ends up fighting his way through, becoming kind of like a folk legend hero, and befriends this princess that's trying to get her kingdom back. It's a very cliche story, in all honesty, but the added element of putting this civilization as a really small people where they are riding grasshoppers, they're fighting like they're fighting rats and stuff like it's a big threat. Like I think there's even a part where there's like a possum or something in the gladiator competition. That's like what they're bringing in. It's just like, you add that extra layer to like even the most generic of stories, and it just really elevates it. It makes it that much more interesting. Really makes the stakes, colossal. I know it's a horrible pun. And about a year later, after the Atom had smashed onto the scene, we would see the rise of another shrinking hero, Hank Pym, the Ant-Man. Though his origin is pretty similar to that of Ray Palmer's, his background, it's pretty much the same. They're both scientists. They're both working on a way to shrink themselves down, and they both do it. They both succeed. They try it out on themselves, and it works. The difference is that Ant-Man is a more grounded character, I guess you could say, because he doesn't really shrink to the same level. Like, he actually finds a happy medium in between the other two characters that we had just talked about. He doesn't shrink. He shrinks smaller than Doll Man, but he can't shrink down as small as the Atom. At least not in the early comics. Eventually, I think he can go to quantum level, which is pretty much where the Atom can do, as far as I'm aware. But in the early stories, he was always portrayed as an ant size, because that was his whole namesake. And in the first actual Ant-Man story is very much a like kind of a one-shot horror story. He shrinks down, and he gets trapped within his lab, and there's ants in the area, and he has to fight his way through them. He has to show off his cunning and his intelligence as a small person in order to survive. It's actually a really interesting idea. It turns the whole genre of the shrinking hero into a horror story, and it would be a horrible thing to be trapped as a small person and not really be prepared for it. But after that story was pretty popular, so they just kind of like turned the character into a superhero, gave him like this helmet and the power to control ants. The thing that really kind of separated Ant-Man from the Atom was the fact that Ant-Man, he used the things around him, the ants, much more effectively and to a much greater degree than Atom ever used anything. Atom was more of a solo hero, while Ant-Man was more of a kind of like a Aquaman type character. He used the aid of the animal kingdom around him, or the insect kingdom, and that was his thing. Like he could do so much with it, and the writers and artists could do so much with that concept. Riding an ant, using an army of ants to like cross through a body of water. Just weird, silly things like that you could do. And then when you added the whole quantum realm years later, it becomes even more, elevated with what you can do story-wise. Eventually, later on, the Ant-Man persona would go to a new character, Scott Lang, who was a ex-con, known for his thieving ability, breaking and entering, and all of a sudden, the perfect character got the perfect ability for that character. It was just, it works, like the shrinking ability works best when you're a sneaky character, when you're trying to infiltrate places, when you're trying to go unnoticed. And it was just a really cool. It was really cool to finally see that someone who was using this power set to its full potential. The bottom line is that the ability to shrink is not a sexy ability. It's not a flashy ability. It's not a desirable ability in the greater, sense of, water cooler conversations and, superhero power contests or whatnot. It has its uses. It has its creativity purposes, in the in the art studio, in the writer room. You can do a lot with it. It's a very visionary ability, and it has become a staple in the comic book world as a superhero archetype. Let me know in the comments who your favorite shrinking superhero is, why you like that particular character over the other ones. And also let me know, even if it's not on this list, let me know who your favorite one is, because there are other ones from other companies and stuff. Also, let me know if you even like this power set. If you think the shrinking superhero is kind of a silly or stupid thing in general, or do you like it? Is it a power that you would like to have? Would it be your first choice? Would it be your 16th choice? Let me know in the comments. Thank you guys for watching, and see you for more videos.